Is it possible to quarrel with a loved one over car tire pressure? For one spouse in Perry, it certainly was. Their foolish argument ended tragically for one of them. Stanford Memorial Church was Arlis's sanctuary, a place to escape troubles and find peace. Entering 10 minutes before closing time, the young woman approached the altar and knelt in prayer. At that moment, she was alone in the majestic building. The last parishioners had crossed paths with her as she walked in. Suddenly, a door slammed somewhere behind her. Perhaps another university student had decided to say a nighttime prayer. However, this was no student at all. It was death itself stalking Arlis. Arlis Kaide Kima was born February 22, 1955 in the small town of Linton, North Dakota, the youngest of 3 children. Her parents Marvin and Jean were devout Christians, actively involved in the Presbyterian Church. Thus, from an early age, their children considered attending church an integral part of their lives. In 1963, when Arlis was 8, the family moved to Bismarck, North Dakota's capital, a quiet, isolated town on the Missouri River's eastern banks, surrounded by forests. The Dykmas ran their own car dealership and helped establish a Reformed church in town, later renamed Bismarck Community Church. Marvin served as an elder, while Jean acted as Sunday school director. Consequently, their children spent much time at church. Arlis was described as compassionate and trusting, with a certain naivety towards others. She always saw the good in people, not dwelling on their flaws. As Arlis grew older, her extracurricular activities remained closely tied to the church. She taught Sunday school and worked with a youth Christian organization spreading Jesus' teachings to strengthen teenagers' faith, like her parents did. Overall, Arlis lived a sheltered life, never leaving Bismarck and staying under the watchful eye of older family members. In high school, Arlis met a young man named Bruce Perry, and they immediately felt strong mutual attraction. The two quickly became a couple, trying to spend every free moment together. Bruce also came from a large family, second of John and Duncan Perry's 4 children. His mother was a homemaker, and his father a dentist. Bruce was born and raised in a quiet Midwestern town, enjoying a comfortable childhood. He was quite popular in his class, excelling in sports and setting numerous local track and field records. Additionally, Bruce was very intelligent and focused on his studies, planning to attend Stanford University's medical school after graduation to pursue further education in that field. In 1973, Bruce Perry finished high school and moved over 1,200 miles away, leaving Arlis in North Dakota. Stanford University was located in Palo Alto, California. The boy's athletic achievements helped him realize his dreams. His girlfriend also decided to continue her education, but chose to stay home, enrolling in Bismarck Community College. Simultaneously, Bruce's father Duncan offered the student a job as a secretary in his dental office. Arlis's life was quite busy. She balanced studies, work at the dentist's office, and in her free time continued promoting her church. She served as a missionary, organized various church events, and participated in Christian organizations such as Young Life and Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. Despite the vast distance between Arlis and Bruce, their relationship endured. The young lovers exchanged lengthy, affectionate letters and occasionally connected via landline phone. The 1,000-plus mile gap couldn't extinguish their youthful romance. Instead, it strengthened their feelings for each other. Bruce's first year at Stanford proved a challenging test for both. Upon completing his studies, Bruce returned home for summer. He'd awaited this moment for what felt like an eternity, so he immediately proposed to Arlis. The young man couldn't fathom living apart from his girlfriend for several more years, so their engagement became their release from the burden of separation. The wedding took place on August 17, 1974, at Bismarck's Reformed Church. Surrounded by close relatives and friends, the young couple vowed to stand by each other in sickness and in health. They spent their brief honeymoon in a cabin owned by Bruce's parents. Come fall, when it was time to resume studies, the newlyweds journeyed together to Palo Alto, California. They settled in Quillen Hall in Escondido Village, a Stanford University residence designated exclusively for married couples. At the time, Bruce was a second-year medical student, spending his days in the library, attending lectures, or completing hospital rotations. The young man also worked part-time to support himself and his wife, Arlis. The newlywed wife spent most of her time on campus as a homemaker, using her free hours to explore the grounds, familiarize herself with the surroundings, and learn new things. Arlis quickly realized how different California was from North Dakota. The young woman was accustomed to her small town's conservative atmosphere, and now she found herself thrust into the technical progress of liberal California at the tail end of the hippie era. Arlis witnessed many things she'd never seen before. The only downside was her husband's complete immersion in studies and work to support their family. Although the couple was now together, they didn't spend much time with each other. Arlis often found herself alone, so she began visiting Stanford Memorial Church, which offered her sanctuary and peace whenever she needed it. Later, Arlis took a job as a secretary at a nearby law firm. Initially, the young woman frequently wrote to her family friends back in Bismarck about feeling sad and lonely. In one letter to her sister, she mentioned how difficult it was to make friends here. Arlis was often tempted to knock on a random door and ask if anyone needed a friend. However, once she visited Stanford Memorial Church and was instantly captivated, the tone of her messages changed dramatically. She'd never seen such a grand and beautiful place before. This discovery gave her something new and exciting to look forward to. In truth, Arlis simply needed time to adjust to her new location and role as a wife. She had never left Bismarck before, so her first weeks in Palo Alto were indeed challenging. The young lover's life was gradually improving. Arlis and Bruce had started to adapt to married life, settled into their small campus nest, and were making grand plans for the future. However, as often happens, one minor quarrel completely altered their fate. On the night of October 12, 1974, Stanford's campus was bustling with activity. This was due to ongoing sports competitions between Stanford University and the University of California, Los Angeles. Football games had been drawing much attention lately, so that evening students from different schools gathered in dorm rooms for numerous parties. Sounds of music and lively laughter could be heard here and there. The Perrys didn't plan to join the general merriment. Bruce wanted to spend the evening immersed in studying, while Arlis intended to walk to the mailbox. She had several letters addressed to her friends and family in Bismarck. For her, there was nothing unusual about going out in the evening. California weather allowed for enjoyable walks. But due to everything happening on campus, Bruce didn't want his wife wandering alone. So he briefly set aside his medical textbook and decided to accompany her. It was a chance to get some fresh night air and clear his head. This was an excellent opportunity to spend some time together, as they mainly saw each other only in the bedroom due to studies and work. Around 11:30 p.m., the couple left their residence and leisurely headed towards the mailbox. They chatted about trivial matters until the conversation turned to their car. A small argument arose between husband and wife regarding tire pressure. It was such a minor issue, not worth quarreling over at all. However, the young people had a serious falling out. They were just passing by Stanford Memorial Church when Arlis expressed her desire to be alone to cool off. She said she'd go to the church and spend some time by herself. The temple's silence always calmed her. Bruce agreed they'd both overreacted, so he headed back to their apartment, located just a mile from the church, and Arlis entered the building. The clock showed 11:50, with 10 minutes until closing. The young woman passed two parishioners preparing to leave the church. She descended to the front pews on the altar's left side and knelt to pray. The parishioners noticed Arlis looked slightly upset. As they exited, they encountered another young man also heading inside past them. He appeared to be about 20 to 25 years old. Blonde hair, athletic build, nothing remarkable. He wore a blue short-sleeved shirt. At 12:10 a.m., night guard Stephen Crawford entered the church, looked around, saw no one, and called out that he was about to lock the main gates, just in case. If any visitors were in the hall, they would have hurried to exit. Since no one responded, the man turned off the lights, locked the doors, then continued his campus rounds. Meanwhile, Bruce, having calmed down from their silly argument, waited about 20 minutes after the church closed. When Arlis still hadn't come home, he went to look for her. The young man reached the temple, pulled the doors, but they were already locked for the night. He then walked around campus and nearby areas, but didn't encounter Arlis. Bruce guessed they had likely missed each other. Now his young wife, not finding him at home, might think he was still angry. Feeling a surge of affection for his spouse and berating himself for the ridiculous situation, the young man hurried home. However, the apartment was empty, with no sign of his wife. Bruce thought they had missed each other again, so he stayed to wait for Arlis's return. A couple of hours later, night guard Stephen Crawford made a second round in the church, just to ensure no one had broken in, given the students' festive mood. He opened the temple's front door, did a full sweep, checked all nooks, tugged the side exit handle, and locked up again. Bruce, now restless, pondered where his wife could have gone. Perhaps she was so offended by their argument that she decided to spite him by dropping in on a party. Though he immediately dismissed this thought, knowing Arlis wasn't one to enjoy spending time with tipsy students. At 3 a.m, when the young woman still hadn't come home, Bruce became genuinely frightened. A baseless fear settled in the back of his mind, so he decided it was time to involve the police. The student informed the emergency dispatcher that his wife hadn't returned home. The young man was certain Arlis had fallen asleep in the church and was now locked inside. He was adamant that his wife was still inside, so 2 police officers went to the temple to check Bruce's assumption. They circled the building's perimeter, knocked on the door, listening for any response to the knocking. But absolute silence reigned inside the church, and the patrolman returned empty-handed. At 5:45 a.m., the guard, finishing his shift, returned to the temple to open it for worshippers. Entering the building, he noticed one of the side doors was ajar. Naturally, the watchman first rushed to check if the interior had been vandalized or if anything had been stolen. Everything seemed in order, but there had to be a reason why the side door was unlocked. Soon, he indeed discovered what he least expected to see at the end of his work shift. In the church's front section, on the floor, lay the body of 19-year-old Arlis Perry, right where she was last seen, kneeling in prayer. Crawford immediately contacted the police and his supervisor. Detectives arriving at the crime scene found Arlis lying on her back. She was unclothed below the waist, with her jeans covering the lower part of her body. Her blouse was torn. The girl's hands were crossed on her chest, holding one of the altar candles placed between her fingers. Another longer candle was inserted into her genitals, further desecrating the body. Arlis's neck was broken, and an ice pick with a broken handle protruded from her head behind her left ear. The handle itself was nowhere to be found. Near the deceased's body lay a kneeling cushion on which traces of seminal fluid were later discovered. One of the candles bore a smudged palm print. During the crime scene examination, detectives noticed the side door had been forced open from the inside. Apparently, whoever did this to Arlis was locked inside with her and later had to escape this way. A pair of officers were given the difficult and unpleasant task of locating Bruce Perry in Quillen Hall and delivering the terrible news. When a distressed Bruce opened the door to the police, he was covered in blood. According to him, when stressed, he often experienced severe nosebleeds. and now he was indeed anxious because his wife hadn't returned home. Instead of informing the young man about his wife's death, the officers decided to take him to the police station for questioning. The conversation with Bruce Perry lasted 2 hours. During this time, detectives presented him with several possible scenarios in which Arlis could have upset her husband so much that he committed what's called a crime of passion. Detectives suggested that his wife was cheating on Bruce or had become pregnant, and he didn't want a child, so he decided to take revenge. In most investigations, those closest to the victim usually fall under suspicion first. In this case, given that the couple had moved to California just a few weeks ago, Bruce was indeed the only person Arlis knew. Although Bruce denied any involvement in his wife's disappearance, he wasn't believed, and a blood sample from his shirt was taken as evidence to check if it matched his blood type or Arlis's. Additionally, the confused man was subjected to a polygraph test. The police wanted to ensure Bruce wasn't lying. At the time, the lie detector was considered an accurate device that couldn't be fooled. Comparative DNA analysis in 1974 was still at a fairly low level, so no particular hopes were placed on it. Bruce showed no resistance or unwillingness to cooperate, but he was very angry. Considering that the young man was still worried about his missing wife, it became clear that the detective's actions provoked fury. Instead of searching for his spouse, they were wasting a lot of time interrogating her husband. But until he passed a successful polygraph test, until it was determined that the blood on his shirt didn't match the deceased's blood type, until it was revealed that the palm print on one of the candles didn't match Bruce's palm print, he was considered the #1 suspect. Only when all checks were completed was the young man informed that Arlis had been found lifeless on the church floor. After Bruce was cleared of suspicion, investigators theorized it was a random attack for personal gain, committed by some unstable criminal. So they began checking all previously convicted individuals in the area. With over 100 people, they found no matches. The theory that Arlis was killed by a random malefactor who entered the church and saw a lone girl was rejected, deciding that the perpetrator must have known the church's layout and operating hours well. So the next focus of the detective's attention was the night guard Stephen Crawford, who discovered Arlis's remains. The forensic lab established the approximate time of the girl's death. She died around midnight. A legitimate question arose. If Crawford made rounds in the church at 12:10 a.m. and then at 2 a.m., how could he not have noticed a dead body lying in front of the altar? But the guard insisted he had fully performed his job, thoroughly checked all doors and every corner of the church. And at the time of his rounds, there was no one there. Stephen was a former police officer himself and knew all the intricacies of the job, so it was foolish not to believe him. His lie could only be that he had been negligent in his duties as a guard and hadn't actually checked the church thoroughly. Perhaps he had just glanced in, seen nothing, and moved on. Nevertheless, the man was also asked to undergo a polygraph test, which he passed successfully, and his palm print was compared with the one found on the candle. No matches were found, so all suspicions were soon dropped, and he was released. It was decided that between midnight and 3 a.m., the perpetrator had hidden somewhere inside the church and concealed the victim's body, then placed the girl by the altar, broke open the side door from the inside, and fled. The next morning at 11 a.m., Sunday Mass was held at Stanford Memorial Church. However, the gathering, full of journalists and grieving students, was moved to the lawn in front of the building to preserve the crime scene. The dean of Stanford Chapel suggested that, judging by the symbolic positioning of Arlis's body, this resembled a satanic ritual. The only person with access to the church after hours, besides the guard, was the dean himself, so he too was listed as a suspect, forced to undergo a polygraph test and have his fingerprints taken, again revealing no matches. The memorial service for Arlis was held on October 15, 1974, in the same church where she was found. The entire ceremony was ambiguous. On one hand, Bruce and his family, the Dykema family, sat just a few meters from where the lifeless body was discovered. On the other hand, this church had become one of Arlis's favorite places, so it was a kind of tribute to her memory. Many Stanford University students and faculty attended the service simply to express support for the family. Although among those present, only Bruce, relatives, and a couple of colleagues from the law firm where she had worked for just 2 weeks personally knew the girl. Arlis hadn't had time to meet anyone during her time in Palo Alto. When one of Arlis's colleagues first saw Bruce at the memorial service, he was very surprised. That Friday, October 11th, the day before Arlis's death, a young man had visited her at work. They talked for about 15 minutes, after which Arlis returned to her desk, extremely upset. The colleague assumed it was her husband Bruce, but now, seeing Arlis's real spouse, the law firm employee couldn't get that conversation between the girl and the stranger out of his head on the eve of her death. Realizing that this person wasn't actually her husband, the colleague decided to inform the police about this strange conversation. He had no idea who the man was, could only give a brief description. Blonde, appeared to be about 20 years old, athletic build. This description matched what the two parishioners had given, who had seen Arlis that night in the church when they encountered a young man of similar appearance on their way out. Despite this second mention of a young man fitting the same description, the detectives didn't even attempt to identify or locate him. The description was too broad, potentially matching nearly every other student. Moreover, they had witnesses who had passed by the church between 12:15 and 12:30 a.m. These people heard strange noises coming from inside, but when they stopped to listen, the noise abruptly ceased. The passers-by continued on, deciding they must have imagined it. Meanwhile, Arlis's remains were brought home to Bismarck. The funeral service was held in the same Reformed church where just a couple of months earlier, the girl had married Bruce. Bruce also returned home to attend his wife's funeral and be surrounded by people who loved and supported him. The horrifying details of what happened to Arlis were not made public. At this point, family members were only told that an unknown person had taken her life and that 2 items belonging to the girl were missing from the crime scene. But which items specifically, no one disclosed. The perpetrator had presumably taken them as trophies. Relatives knew nothing about the candle, nothing about the ice pick, nothing about the kneeling cushion with traces of seminal fluid. They were spared these terrible details, at least for the time being. Less than 2 weeks after Arlis's funeral, another strange event occurred in her hometown. The temporary grave marker was stolen from the deceased girl's grave. Other grave monuments remained untouched. The distance between North Dakota and California is considerable, and imagining that the criminal had somehow reached Arlis even here was unsettling and even terrifying. For many people, this became a telling indication that the killer who took Arlis's life resided in Bismarck or its vicinity. Investigators and the public were horrified by the brutal slaying of a defenseless young woman. What could have been going through the perpetrator's mind to commit such a repulsive act, especially in a place where people come seeking protection and assistance? Detectives continued to examine potential suspects, but with each passing month, their confidence in finding the criminal who had desecrated such a sacred place waned. 1 year passed, then 2, then 3, and the authorities still made no headway in the investigation. The public criticized the detectives for inaction. Lacking other leads, the police turned to the FBI for help, requesting a specialist to create a profile of the individual who had deprived Arlis of her life. The profiler stated that the person was likely a loner, without family, who kept meticulous records about the church and its parishioners. He might have had a military background, with an approximate age between 17 and 22. After the crime, he may have kept items belonging to the victim as trophies. Then, in 1979, 5 years after Arlis's death, David Berkowitz, widely known as the serial offender son of Sam, decided to interject himself into the investigation. He penned a letter suggesting he knew who had sent Arlis to the great beyond. Investigators traveled across the country to New York State to interrogate David, who was incarcerated at the time. This individual had been sentenced to 6 life terms for involvement in 8 shootings that resulted in several innocent casualties. David was known for seeking attention. He initially told the FBI that a demon disguised as his neighbor's dog had ordered him to end people's lives. Eventually, he abandoned this absurd story and admitted to fabricating it all. Now, serving his sentence, he sent letters to police departments nationwide about various crimes, relishing the attention it garnered. It was evident that David was bored in prison, and upon hearing about the church incident, he decided to contribute his own hypotheses. David chose to elaborate on the satanic cult angle, claiming Arlis Perry had been under surveillance for a long time. Cult members from North Dakota allegedly traveled to Stanford specifically to eliminate the young woman who was spreading God's word. The first investigator who arrived in New York to question David realized within half an hour that all his statements were false, mere fantasies concocted in his troubled mind, and that they had simply wasted time, although some later believed David's tales. The Satanist narrative continued in 1987, 13 years after the church crime. A former New York Post columnist, Maury Terry, authored a book titled The Ultimate Evil, presenting his theory about what happened to Arlis Perry that night. He essentially continued David's story, stating that a year before moving to California, the young woman had made several attempts to convert cult members to Christianity, and they decided to seek revenge. The author also insisted that the man who visited Arlis at the law firm a day before her demise, with whom she had an unpleasant conversation, was one of the cult members. These discussions began emerging after Arlis's parents revealed that their daughter indeed traveled around the area as a missionary, trying to convert non-believers and essentially save their souls. This was part of her work. Near Bismarck, there existed a cult called the Church of the Final Judgment, where rituals were conducted. Before departing for Palo Alto, Arlis went there to attempt to convert people to the true faith. However, investigators didn't believe this had any connection to what happened to Arlis. They found it much more likely that the perpetrator had staged the crime scene to divert attention from himself. The church wasn't symbolic to him, but it certainly helped advance the Satanism theory and thereby generate numerous rumors in the media and announcements. Rather, detectives linked the crime to 2 similar incidents where 2 other young women met their demise at Stanford University. 21-year-old Leslie Marie Perloff, a recent Stanford graduate, vanished in February 1973 after leaving the law library where she worked as a clerk. Her peer Janet Ann Taylor was visiting friends on Stanford University campus and attempted to hitchhike home. She disappeared in March 1974, and her body was only found a year later, but circumstantial evidence indicated these cases were unrelated. Although Arlis Perry's case was eventually closed, investigators never ceased their search for the perpetrator. The lead detective always kept a photo of the young woman with him as a reminder that justice needed to be served sooner or later. The cold case unit in the district attorney's office regularly reviewed the case over many years. Law enforcement knew that the Perry and Dykema families never stopped believing that the villain who took Arlis's life would face deserved punishment. And in 2018, 44 years after her passing, the long-awaited breakthrough finally occurred. The sheriff's office continued submitting evidence to the forensics lab, hoping for a breakthrough in the case, and it finally arrived. DNA comparison technology had advanced significantly. A semen sample found on Arlis's pillow and jeans was sent for testing once again, and a miracle occurred. The DNA sample matched one of the previous suspects in the case. It was none other than the night watchman, Stephen Crawford. By then, the man was 72 years old. He was a U.S. Air Force veteran who later served as a police officer. In 1971, he began working for Stanford University's Department of Public Safety, though not by choice. A new police chief decided to reduce staff by 75%. Stephen was among those offered a security guard position in exchange for his badge, which he strongly disliked. He perceived the offer as an insult. For many years, he constantly complained about being treated unfairly. The former serviceman despised his new role. He eventually quit 2 years after Arlis's death. In fact, Stephen was caught committing fraud. He had forged a diploma using a blank university form. During this investigation, it was also discovered that this wasn't the only crime he had committed during his years on campus. The guard had stolen and sold several historically valuable items, including about 200 rare books, numerous Native American artifacts, and even the university founder's walking stick. For this case, Stephen received a 6-month suspended sentence and 2 years of probation. The former military man moved to San Jose, California, and lived a relatively peaceful, quiet life until the DNA match surfaced in the database. On June 20, 2018, investigators arrived at his apartment. Knocking on the door, they announced their presence. Crawford asked through the door for a couple of minutes to get dressed. When the police burst into the home, Stephen was sitting on his bed, armed with a pistol. The officers immediately retreated, fearing he might open fire. A second later, a shot rang out. Stephen Crawford was found lying on the bed with a bullet wound to his head. His death was pronounced at the scene. A search of the apartment uncovered a copy of Maury Terry's book, The Ultimate Evil, which discussed Arlis Perry's unsolved crime, as well as a handwritten recusal note Stephen had written 2 years earlier, in 2016, when investigators were questioning people and collecting DNA samples. It was evident that Stephen had feared all his life that he would eventually be found and linked to the crime at Stanford Memorial Church. When the police knocked on his door, he likely decided his time had come. The guard wanted to throw investigators off track by staging the crime scene in a way that suggested a ritual killing. However, we'll never know for certain why he did what he did, as Stephen died before investigators could question him again. Unfortunately, Arlis's father, Marvin Dykema, passed away just 3 months prior, never learning who was responsible for his daughter's death. The young woman's mother, Jean Dykema, was 88 years old at the time and shared what 44 years of waiting for justice had cost the family. The only thing that comforted the woman all this time was knowing there's someone more powerful than the police who could punish the offender. And people needn't worry about it, as Arlis couldn't be brought back. Bruce Perry earned his medical degree from Northwestern University and subsequently became a world-renowned expert in child mental health. He specialized in working with children who had experienced severe traumas, such as the Columbine High School massacre, the Waco siege, and the Oklahoma City bombing. Bruce has appeared on television numerous times, sharing his research and methods. He's also an author of 3 books, one of which he wrote as a student with Oprah Winfrey. Bruce remarried and understandably doesn't wish to speak publicly about Arlis and what happened to her. Regrettably, Stephen Crawford managed to evade justice for 44 long years and live to an advanced age, unlike Arlis Perry, whose life he cut short at 19. One can only hope that he'll answer for her death before a higher power. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.